Alright, gang, story number 2, ready or not, here it comes. The American conservative movement, more and more, is reminding me of the blind men in the old fairy tale, fable, call it whatever you want. The four or five blind men who, were presented with an elephant for the first time, right? And one of the blind men, felt on it, felt its trunk, and said, "Oh, the elephant is like a snake." Another one felt its foot and its leg, and said, "No, no, 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 no. The elephant is like a leather bag." Another one felt its tail and said, "No, no, 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 no. The elephant is like a horse." And another one felt its ears and said, "The elephant is like a fan," etc. Another one felt its tusk and said, "Well, the elephant is like a spear." And of course, when they left, they could not agree on actually what the elephant was because they were all blind. They couldn't see it. And because they only felt a part of it, that part therefore became the entirety of the elephant. So they were all wrong. American conservatism is becoming those blind men, those blind mice, as you will. And this was really, really pounded into my head this past week, because finally, the moldy old Muppet in the Oval Office, and that is an image I do not want in my head, because if he's a Muppet, then there has to be someone playing on his strings or putting their hand up him to control his mouth and his hands, and we thought Biden himself, we thought the Muppet itself had a problem with touching people. But anyway, the moldy old Muppet in the Oval Office finally deigned to address the nation about the Mishava of Afghanistan. Yes, we're talking about Afghanistan again. I am not sorry. And it was David Marcus at the New York Post just had a great piece about it. I'll link to it in the description box below, where he said that it was a temper tantrum, actually, on Biden's part. How dare anyone disagree with him? And I believe it was in this address that he both blamed Trump for the entire Mishava, the entire debacle of the evacuation, i.e. the leaving with our tail between our legs of Afghanistan, before taking all the credit for it. And in response to that temper tantrum, that presidential, almost octogenarian temper tantrum, Ann Coulter, who actually used to be a pretty big commentator on the right, I think still is in a sense, although she has lost some of her sparkle, some of her status, I think, some of her, what's the word that I'm looking for, she's not as relevant. She is not nearly as relevant anymore as she used to be in the early aughts during the George W. Bush administration. But on August 31st, in response to the moldy old Muppet's speech, addressed to the nation, quote unquote, my apologies, Ann Coulter on Twitter said this: "Trump repeatedly demanded that we bring our soldiers home, but only President Biden had the balls to do it. Here are a few of Trump's wuss BS, I mean, quote unquote, masterful tweets." Now, there's a lot that can actually be said just on that. I mean, in the first place, Biden doesn't even have any balls, okay? He's a deranged, close to 80-year-old man who is every single day demonstrating much more clearly to us, to everyone who has eyes to see here and abroad, that he hasn't just lost his marbles, he threw his marbles into the river and has absolutely no intention of fishing for even one, so that he could perhaps, possibly, do at least some of the duties required by his office. Did you see, actually, the clip, gang, where he apparently fell asleep when he was actually discussing issues with the Israeli prime minister. They weren't Zooming a meeting or anything. They were actually sitting in the same room together, and apparently Biden nodded off to sleep. Did you see, for example, when they brought home the bodies of those 13 dead Marines killed by the Taliban suicide bombers at the Kabul International Airport, and everyone on the left was, oh my gosh, this is so great. Biden is going to meet the plane with their bodies. He is going to perform one of the most solemn actions that a president can do. And what did the photographers catch? Joe Biden, apparently the alpha male, America is back baby president, looking at his watch. Because apparently, one of the most sacred and solemn duties of a president, that cuts into tapioca and Matlock time in the basement of the Oval Office. He needs to get down there where they have the plush carpet, where he can just take off his shoes, take off the suit, throw on some sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and he can watch reruns of Matlock, Leave It to Beaver, maybe the Andy Griffith Show too. Those are his priorities. So, Biden has no balls. And in fact, if Biden actually had balls, this was another point that David Marcus brought up in his piece. If Biden actually had any balls, he would actually fess up and admit, hey, yeah, you know what? We made serious mistakes. We made serious mistakes, which is why the Taliban is actually taking over the country much, much faster than anyone even thought. Remember, gang, it was only a month before in July when everyone was assuring us that everything that we saw happen last month in August in Afghanistan was never, ever, ever, ever going to happen. We were going to have an orderly evacuation. The Taliban was going to stay where it was. It wasn't going to dare think about doing anything. The 300,000 strong Afghan National Army, it was going to do a bang-up job if those terrorists even thought about breaking the terms of the deal. And then it all collapsed. It got so bad, in fact, gang, that the American forces, the generals, hightailed it out of there without even telling their NATO soldiers that they were leaving. They abandoned military animals like rescue dogs, military dogs. They abandoned 100 or so Americans. 100 Americans are still stranded in Afghanistan. They don't know how they're going to get home. The Pentagon and the State Department, they don't have a flipping clue how they're going to get those guys back home. And right now, I don't care if they're the most ultra right-wing, right-leaning conservatives, or if they are all, effeminate, pink-wearing, hippie, emasculated, castrated men right now. I don't care at this point. Because a basic principle of statecraft and of politics is that you don't leave your people behind. You don't leave your people behind, especially when the country that you've spent the last 20 years occupying is in the process of being rapidly reconquered by the enemy that you couldn't even wipe out within those 20 years. You don't leave those people behind, because then, not just because of the principle of the thing, but then also because there's the practical side of the issue too. People start wondering, you know what? Is the government going to do that to me at some point? If I find myself in a dangerous situation somewhere, maybe not even overseas, but is the government actually going to do everything it can to ensure my protection, my legitimate protection against foreign powers? It's a legitimate question. So, if Biden had actually had any balls, he would have fessed up and owned those mistakes and said what he had said during the campaign. Remember, one of the few campaign promises Biden made was that the buck was going to stop at his desk with him because he's the president. He wasn't going to shift it off to lackeys and underlings or the press like the Orange Man had done. No, he was going to take full responsibility. Yeah, he didn't. Had a golden opportunity to do so, and he didn't. So, Biden has no balls. So Coulter is smoking something, even when she's writing that. Second of all, and here's the big issue, as Razorfist, the Rageaholic himself, noted in a recent video, which I will also link to in the description box below, Trump last year already had a plan to get us out of Afghanistan. It was a plan that the warlords liked, the Taliban liked, the provisional government liked, all the various pieces and vying interests in Afghanistan were actually on board with Trump's plan. Now, as Razor said, we will never actually know if that plan would have worked or if everything still would have gone to hell in a handbasket even with Trump's plan, because that plan was never actually allowed to be executed. Because this was the plan when Biden actually upped the times table. He said, no, we're not leaving. When Trump said, I think it was going to be at the end of this year, Trump's plan would have us leave Afghanistan. Biden said, no, we're going to be leaving by September 11th. The 20th anniversary of 9/11, by the by. And that was the domino falling that created all this chaos. Because then the Taliban thought, wait a minute, this Biden guy, he's not serious. And then everyone else saw that Biden wasn't serious. And then the Taliban started pushing and pushing and pushing, seeing how much they could get away with. And now we see exactly what they've been able to get away with. The entire country of Afghanistan. So, I don't know what Coulter is on. And this, too, is actually very Coulter. It's very interesting. Coulter was one of the most pro-Trump people that you could ask for back in 2015. She wrote an entire book called In Trump We Trust, E Pluribus Awesome, arguing that Trump was the only man for the job. And now she is one of the biggest Trump haters out there. Now, to be fair to Coulter, and just to be objective, I think that Trump was a much better candidate than he was a president. I think that he still did some good things in office, but he was much tougher, much more rugged, just much more bullish on the campaign trail than he actually was in office for whatever reason. But even then, too, on the other hand, as they say in Fiddler on the Roof, that doesn't quite let Coulter on the hook because she has a history of flipping back and forth. I remember reading a piece, I forget by whom or where it was, on what website. It might have been Renew America. But someone was commenting back. This might have been 2013, 2014. Someone was commenting that Ann Coulter had always kind of flipped and flopped. They brought up the 2012 election. One day, Mitt Romney was the most horrible candidate that we could ask for. My gosh, vote for anybody in the primaries except for Romney, which actually turned out to be the right take. And then the very next column she would write, oh my gosh, Mitt Romney is the only one who can go up against Barack Obama. You've got to vote for Romney because he's the only one who actually has a chance. It was this continuous flip-flop, 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 which just made me think in my mind that she is not actually a serious person. She likes to be a contrarian. That's where she's in her element. She wants to feel like she's going against the flow. She's the rebel. She's also the one, I remember, Mike Castle, I think, who was a very liberal Republican. This would have been in 2010, 2012, something around in there during one of the midterms. Was running for the Senate seat in Delaware, I want to say. And people actually, Republican voters didn't vote for him in the primaries. They voted for his Tea Party opponent, who was, I forget what her name was. And Coulter was just raising a cow over this, like, oh, Mike Castle was a shoo-in for that seat, and we just need people with R's behind their name in the House and the Senate so we can keep our majority. Yeah, and like that's ever done any good before. There might be a holding movement, but when you actually want to shift the energy back in your direction, you can't have holding units. So, movements, I should say. So Ann Coulter has always been a flip-flopper, I think. Now, what is most fascinating, however, about all this is that actual serious people whom I respect were actually retweeting Coulter and saying, my gosh, he is the only commentator with the balls to actually say this, what everyone is thinking. My gosh, she is based. She is conservative. She is wonderful. which is actually why I said at the beginning of my video why the American conservative movement is reminding me more and more and more of the blind men with the elephant. Because all of what I just said, gang, in these last 12, 11 minutes went completely unnoticed by them. All that mattered is that Ann Coulter was saying what they wanted to hear. But to raise a point that the only commentator that I really listen to and respect anymore, Mark Stein, said, the problem with Ann Coulter's take, the problem with everyone who is praising her, let me just read exactly what Stein says because it's wonderful. The teeniest flaw in the Biden-Coulter worldview is this. They seem to think that World Policeman is like the World Series. If Americans aren't playing, nobody is. Yesterday, I, Mark Stein, appeared on India Up Front and was pleasantly surprised to find that my host and 3/4 of the guests were addressing the subject where it lies in reality, the end of the American moment and the question of what comes next. American TV seems to find this too painful a subject to discuss, but Delhi Telly has no choice. With the fall of Afghanistan, India is now surrounded by China and Chinese client states, which tends to concentrate the mind, especially when it's no secret that Beijing would dearly love to knock off Delhi economically and otherwise. And then just today, the Taliban leadership in Kabul announced that their new partner in rebuilding Afghanistan was going to be, guess who? 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. And if you guessed China or Beijing or Chairman Xi or the Chinese Pooh Bear, give yourself a gold star, because that is exactly who is going to be working with the Taliban to quote-unquote rebuild Afghanistan. They are going to make Afghanistan part of the Belt and Road Initiative, by which China is gobbling up more and more and more of the world without even firing a shot. The problem with being blind in a world full of panthers, lions, tigers, and all sorts of predators that want to devour you is that you don't see them coming, and then when they're on top of you, you completely misunderstand what the danger actually is. You're feeling the teeth of the jaguar and thinking, whoo, the jaguar is like a sword. And then it actually rips out your throat. That is story number 2.